We are learning to trust the ever-evolving rhythms of nature.
We are committed to embracing our shadow within community
and reclaiming our sovereignty.
We do this together.
That is the way.
Okay, so this evening we have Kyle Koch with us. Kyle is a friend of mine that I met first through Instagram, I believe. Trotting Sparrow. It's like, who's this badass Wolverine doing all this parkour stuff and all this other good stuff? And then I met you in real life at Rafe Kelley's Return to the Source event. You're a facilitator there. And I absolutely loved the way you approached your teaching. And you had a lot of stuff surrounding like nature connection, which I found to be super rad. And also the parkour stuff was awesome too. So I was blown away with the way you taught and just your general energy and what you brought to Rafe's event. And so here we are today chatting with you, learn a little bit more about you. And yeah, I'll leave it at that. So I guess my first question that I have, what brought you to the nature connection stuff, and what would you call it too?
Yeah, I think nature connection is a really good way to frame it. I originally approached it from a standpoint of like survival skills because I was working in IT and I quickly realized that if I don't have a computer or the internet or electricity, my skill set is very limited. And I started watching like Man versus Wild, Dual Survival, and I got really like kind of stoked on like what's possible with very little. And that inspired me to take a 3-day survival course. And I made my first bow drill fire. And it was kind of like a wild experience of like doing it, and people were like yelling at me, and I'm like trying to do it, and I eventually got frustrated, and I like threw my kit down and walked away. And then people were like, "Dude, you have a coal." And I was like, "What?" Like, I don't really know what that is. And I go over, and my board has this like little glowing ember, and I scooped it in to a tinder bundle, and I blew it into flames. And in that moment, I was like, I'm an infinite well of untapped potential. Like, I'm a dragon. Like, I just made fire with sticks. And that kind of just led me down the rabbit hole of like, what am I capable of? And I ended up going to a 9-month wilderness, like nature connection, survival school, like thinking that I was like, oh, cool. Like, I'm going to learn how to live in the woods. I'm gonna learn how to like trap animals and like do all this stuff. And what I actually got from that program was like a deep sense of belonging and an awareness of human potential in relationship with the natural world. Well, when I left the school, I was like forever changed. You know,
How long ago was that?
2011.
Okay.
But I was like, I don't really know what happened to me. And so after leaving the school, I kind of went on this quest to like figure out what happened to me in that experience, because a lot of it is like this implicit learning, right? Like you're being changed by having experiences. You're not like, you're like not like studying something and then doing it and then like, oh yeah, like I'm learning a language. You're like, I don't know how I can do what I can do. Like, so I went on this journey to deconstruction and reverse engineer that. Like, what happened to me? Can we replicate this? Can I do this for other people? And I ended up working at the school for about 6 years, both doing the intake of the students, facilitating, and then watching them leave. And I got to watch over 500 students like come through this process. And And then through like podcasts and science and experience and interviews, I got a pretty good sense of how to do that.
Yeah, what are the keys? Like how do you do that?
A good framing is called an ecology of practices. So creating a safe container for people to drop in to these experiences, and then allowing them to participate in these practices, and then kind of like educing out their stories and validating their experiences is really kind of how that's done. It's like a cultural mentoring model. And when you have all of these things in place, it's like how do you grow a tree? Right? It's like, do you just plant it in the ground? It's like, well, you do, but maybe you need some fertilizer, maybe you need to prep the soil, you need some mycorrhizal relationships, you need to water it, you need some wind stimulation, right? And so that's kind of how I think about these experiences that I'm facilitating. It's like, yeah, like how do you grow a tree? It's like, well, how do you give somebody a sense of belonging? It's like, well, there's a lot, and then there's also all these things that I'm not doing, right? And that's where like nature and the land is like a core part of the facilitation team.
Yes, snaps indeed. Love that.
Damn, thank you for that. I feel like I just like got everything I needed for the rest of my life right now. I'm gonna tap out. That was dope.
So a question that comes up for me is, with these people that you were working with, these 500 people or so that you like had through this process, like what was their demographic? Like what were the younger people, all of it, like across the board? Like who was
Yeah,
going through these programs?
pretty from 18 to 65, right? From folks fresh out of high school to people taking a break from college to Pinterest executives to pharmaceutical salesmen, kind of people from all walks of life. I think recognizing this similar thread of disconnection. And often they're not able to put the finger on it, just as I was. Like, if you would ask me before the program, like, why am I doing this? Like, why am I quitting, this lucrative IT job, my 401k, my health insurance, my, apartment? Like, why am I leaving all of these things? I'd be like, well, I don't know. I'm going to go learn some cool skills. But often what you find in this process is the discovery of the level of disconnection, the lack of meaning, and kind of the like dullness of life. That is like it's like present, but like you don't really know, right? It's like you don't know what it's like to go skydiving until you go skydiving. And then you're like, oh my God, like that was, like you don't really know, you don't know what it's like to take hallucinogenics, like to take psychedelics until you do it. And often, right, when we take psychedelics, people are like, oh, wow, like I had this awakening experience that was more real than this world that I'm in. And when you connect to the natural world, you're like, there's almost this like grief of like, wow, like I didn't, like where I grew up, like I didn't know any of the trees. I didn't know any of the plants. I didn't know any of the animals. Like I didn't realize like who was living in and around me, on a daily basis. I was like, yeah, there's probably like some raccoons and I see some deer, but like that was kind of like it. And then as you get connected to the world, you start to realize, how disconnected you were. It's kind of like when you're like when you get healthy or when you get strong, you're like, holy, like, oh, this is what it's like to be strong. I thought I was like, okay. But now I realize like, wow, I wasn't that capable.
There's this thing that you're speaking to, Kyle. Like I just like I want to like pull it out a little bit more, if you don't mind. I don't know how to frame this in a question, so I'm just gonna like talk for a second. But there is a question implicit to this that maybe I'll get to, maybe I won't. But I want to see where you can bring it. So one of the things that is coming up for me as I'm listening to you is like understanding. It's like I live in a city, right? Like I'm right now a pretty urban dweller, but that was not the case like a year ago. I was like very like more like coastal plains area in California. And one of these experiences that I've had is like being out in the world, like in like the natural world, right? Like the world that has less man-made stuff on it. And like feeling like something within me that like I couldn't name, like wake up. And it was like it didn't feel like I had like learned something new. It felt like I had remembered something old. And as I've been listening to like more recently, like really listening to a lot of indigenous voices, like talking about the experiences, like the wisdom traditions that are passed down, it's like this recollection that like my ancestors knew this stuff.
Mm.
And I'm curious like how, if and how like that type of like remembering energy has shown up in your own journey.
Yeah, for sure. I think one of the ways I like to look at it, and one of the ways we kind of like teach these things, and Matt, maybe you have some experience in this, but it's like, what do children do naturally? Right? They like to build forts. They like to move around on the ground, right? Like if like a fire to a 4-year-old is like magic, right? They want to like play and feed it and do all these things. And so if you look at like kind of what kids do naturally, like building fort, making fire, imaginally being animals, right? Well, if you were to just continue to do that, you would be a badass hunter gatherer, right? If you just built shelter, like you built forts as a kid, and then as a teenager, and then as a 20-year-old, and then as an adult, you'd be pretty good at building a fort, right? And that fort is a shelter, right? And so you kind of have these like natural proclivities. And again, if you play with fire, you get really good at, like, one of the things, my friend, he's really great at this. He just walks around the forest and he just sees what burns. Just grabs it, lights it. No, it doesn't burn. Right? It's like very like childlike. Well, you're getting a lot of information, right? And then you're like, oh, I know what burns. That burns. This doesn't. This, And so I think there's that like natural proclivity to play, and then the imaginally being an animal. I mean, that's what shamans do. That's what you're doing when you're hunting. You're like, okay, the deer was walking or running, and this is based on the stride length, like this is a good sized deer, this is a healthy deer, I want to hunt that deer, right? So I think it's very natural. So yeah, that sense of remembering is like, oh wow, like these are things that kind of feel innate to like maybe my childlike self.
Mm.
Love that. Thank you. Just tossing in. So my birthday, my solar return was on Saturday of this past week.
Oh, cool. Happy birthday.
Yeah, thanks. I spent the day out in like a relative, I mean, it's not like super wild. Like there's people that come through, but like it's wild enough, like nothing built on it, like out on the coast. There's a lot of sand dunes, and I had the opportunity. I came across some bobcat tracks, and I got to track the bobcat through the sand dunes, and like found the spot where they hunted the rabbit. And it was just like I just happened across it. I wasn't looking, like I wasn't like out there like intending to track. I was like, oh, tracks. Like it was really cool. And just brought me back to that. Thank you.
Yeah, and to kind of connect that thread to like, well, why would we want to do any of this like in our modern context, right? Like I go to the grocery store, like I live in a house, all of these things. Well, what you're doing when you're tracking is you're paying attention and you're picking up on patterns, right? You're like, okay, the footsteps are close together. That might indicate a walk, a slow moving gait. Okay, the footprints are further apart and might indicate a run. Well, if you're in business, like you're doing the same thing. You're like, what's selling? what videos are going viral, how is my messaging, how are these ads doing, how is my thing being received, what are my stats, right? You're tracking this, right? As a dad, like you're tracking your child.
Oh, all the time.
All right, you know
What's
when
working, what's not working.
yeah, you
He's
gotta,
sleeping poorly and he's peeing the bed every night. Okay, how do we fix that?
yeah,
Right? How do you make your life better, in the short term? And what you're speaking to is a very like scientific way of thinking about the world. And you're looking at it through this like nature lens, right? This tracking, right? You're really picking up on a lot of different patterns, right? So
yeah, you could argue that everything is tracking, right? Like if you're looking
yeah.
at a mountain, like that's an old track. That's a track that lets you know there's some continental uplift. All right. If you're looking at a lake, like that's a track. And then even in conversation, like there's this idea of like, well, what is intuition? Right. Well, one definition that I like is intuition is one's implicit ability to pick up on complex patterns. Right. So you're like, I don't know, like based on the relationship that I have with you, I might move closer to you. How do you know when you're too close to somebody in a conversation? Right. Well, you're picking up on like, well, their body language, you're picking up like the relationship, what's being said, how is that changing? Right. There's all of these patterns that you're picking up on subconsciously. You're doing like crazy calculations and you don't know why. But you're like, I don't know why, but I need to like step to the left. And it's like, oh, well, you picked up tree branch hanging, you picked up the wind direction, and something told you that there was a causal effect that might cause that tree branch to fall. You step to the side, like, wow, how'd you know how to do that? And you're like, I don't know, like it just happened.
So you just brought up something that I've been thinking a lot about myself. And it's this idea of like how much I rely on my like active mind and how much I rely on that which is like innately like in me, like my body's intelligence and like an intelligence that I'm not having to like think about as much, but I'm just like kind of being, right? And I have found for myself that when I rely too heavily on my brain, like my thinking brain, it really exhausts me pretty quickly. Like I get tired much easier if I do that. And if I just sort of like let myself, and I have like limited energy, especially having two small young children. So it's like, okay, how am I more efficient? Right. And how do I like draw upon like body intelligence, body wisdom, these sorts of things and other things that you're speaking to. So
yeah, like I bet you are really good at like unconsciously like catching your child.
yeah.
You're like, don't think, you're just like, woo, right? And it's like, well, like that's your intuition, right? You're picking up on like, you're picking up on a complex pattern, you're making a prediction, and yep, I gotta snatch my child. Like he's getting too close, he's gonna knock this over. And like martial arts too, right? You're like, you train the form so that it becomes implicit, right? And that's like this really, I'm doing some Kali, it's like Filipino like knife fighting kind of thing.
I've done that too.
Doing these like complex patterns, and I could feel my brain wanting to think about it. And if I could abstain from the thinking, I could remain in the pattern. Right. And it's like the longer I go in the pattern, the more a thought wants to emerge. And I was like in that battle of like flow state, like not thinking, but yet I am thinking. Because like you said, once you make the unconscious kind of like conscious, it's like a different type of energy. It's like a slower, it's more methodical, and it obviously does us a lot of good when we're like doing tasks. But yeah, I think it's slower and like more directed, but it's not as like innate and quick and responsive.
Yeah.
there was something you just said. It's like, as long as I could, like, I could stay in the pattern, as long as I like abstain from thinking. It's just like, whoa, that's like a one-liner. You gotta take that out and put it somewhere, man. You gotta. But what you so this whole piece around like the innate learning that you brought in kind of early on, and we're like circling around with, it's like, so in my experience of our like the kind of like the dominant cultural narrative is it's top down. We got to like think about it and then we go figure it out and then that's how we integrate. But what you brought in so beautifully is like what's most natural to us, what's most innate is we actually do it the opposite. Like we do, and then like maybe we understand, maybe we never understand, maybe we just keep on doing because maybe we don't think that we have to think about it. We just do it. And in so doing, like we can actually relate in the pattern. Because to be able to think out about the pattern, you have to remove yourself from the pattern, right? You can't like be in it and doing it and thinking about it at the same time. And like this whole, you brought in like, it just brought me back to the moment, right? Because I'm out there on Saturday and I'm at a spot where elephant seals are. And
Oh, sick.
yeah, it's a super dope spot. It was like low tide. Like I never went on a trail. I was like rock hopping for like 2+ miles around the coastline to this cove. And I get out to this spot and I'm just like having a break. I'm sitting there and there's birds and I'm like, I'm not really paying attention to anything, but I'm just there and I'm listening. And as I'm sitting there, I hear a bird like make a different sound than he's been making or they've been making. And in that moment, I'm like, oh, there's an elephant seal that's about to surface. And like, sure enough, I look out and there's the elephant seal just came up right there. It was just like, how like I don't hang out around elephant seals enough to be able to know that like intellectually, but it was like I knew, and there it was like, oh cool, and like just like taken in stride. And it's like one of these things that's coming up with this conversation, like to bring it like into like the very practical, it's like if we're tuned into this knowledge, like we don't have to think of and stress about what to do. We actually just innately know like this is what I need. And I feel like one of the things that what you're doing, and I think like what we're doing as well, that I just want to call out and name is this piece of like, we know what we need. And part of the disconnection that you named is like, to me, at least in my lexicon, is that we've removed ourselves from that knowing. And so we feel disconnected from the truth that's living in this body and these tissues, and like doing what you're offering, like bringing people into these like innate learning experiences where we're just going to go and do this stuff that's natural to us. It's like we find that again, we reconnect to it, we like, and then we can live it, and then that can infuse anything else that we're doing.
Yeah, I mostly agree, but I do want to highlight something.
Do it.
Is for the most part, like, yes. And the same machinery that allows us to be incredibly adaptive and aware also makes us subject to bullshit. Right? Because we have causal patterns and we have corollary patterns. Right? So if we're picking up on corollary patterns and we're making decisions based on that, it's like a false truth, right? Like one of the examples is like, okay, global warming has been happening at the same rate as Caribbean piracy has been declining. So if we want to solve global warming, we should bring back Caribbean piracy. And it's like, well, no, like it's not right. Like people think that there's like a stat like, oh, if you have a bigger wedding, your marriage will last longer. So I should have a really big wedding, right? Well, it's like, well, no, that's not true. It's mostly because people who tend to have big weddings mean they have a bigger friend group, they have more monetary resources, they have these other causal relationships that lead to longer lasting marriages. So like, we need feedback systems in order to entrain that innate knowing. And nature is like the ultimate feedback system, right? It's quick. It's like, cool, I tried to, like, this bird made a sound, an elephant seal appeared. I had a similar experience. A bird was alarming. I paid attention. A sharp-shinned hawk flew by. I'm like, okay, well, I think those are causal relationships. I should also hold space for those to not be related, right? Because that could, if I think everything is related, I can start lying to myself. So I think you're right. These participatory experiences, I think there is this innate knowing, and I think nature trains it in causal patterns. I built a shelter. I slept in the shelter. I was cold as shit. Build a better shelter. I built a shelter. I was super warm and dry. Awesome. These materials that I picked to build my shelter, that was a good idea. So the tighter we have these feedback loops, the better they inform those causal relationships, the more we can trust that innate knowing. Because I think what you said is true. Like, we have it, but we try to filter it through logic, and it's like we might not have good like mechanisms for doing that. And so yeah, I think it's like, yeah, participatory knowing and getting, and then feedback and looking, were those things causal, file that away, and then build that, like, oh yeah, whenever I have like tension in my stomach or like this feeling like, oh, that's my curiosity, I should follow that. Or like, this means I'm in a bad situation. Or maybe you just have gas. Maybe you just ate something, right? It's like, that can also be true.
That was beautiful, man. I want to throw just one more layer into the mix that you just brought in, which, like, because the first thing that when you first started going into it, I immediately went into marketing. And like how like the capitalist marketing schemes, right? Not saying anything's wrong with anything, but capitalist marketing schemes know how to, like, people that are good at it, they know the physiological reactions that will help us to make choices, and they target those reactions. They show us the right colors, they give us the right smells, they give us the right visuals in order to stimulate purchasing. And so any of us that have been exposed to modern marketing, which, I mean, I haven't met someone in a very long time who hasn't been, like, have that we have to actually unpack and unwind, right? And it's like there's like this binding of what is partially true and true together to make money, right? Like, I'm thinking about like soda, right? It's like, here, quench your thirst. It's like, well, actually that's going to dehydrate the shit out of me, but if I associate that, like, I'm going to like keep on gravitating towards it. And what you said about, like, basically what I heard you say is like, you need community to reflect reality in order to really be grounded in reality. And that community could be plants, animals, trees, people, the air, the sun, like a mirror, who knows, but like, it's all there.
Oh yeah, what I would push back a little bit with your language right there, Eldon, right? Where it's like, it's not community you need, it's not the environment you need, you need both, right? Like, you need the natural environment, because the nature is it's just what is, right? And you have to like work with which is in front of you. And as you were saying, Kyle, it's like the ultimate feedback system, right? If, you know, in my own practice, I'm becoming an acupuncturist, right? And if I do a certain set of needles and that doesn't work, it's like, well, I did something wrong, right? Like, it's the book said it was going to work. My community of acupuncturists said it was going to work, but it didn't work. So clearly something was off. So I need to update my model, right? And you know, this can be extrapolated to any sort of thing, right? If we're working with the physical world, it's like, it's an immovable force, and we can definitely lie to ourselves and kind of convince ourselves that something worked when it didn't. But at a certain point, you just can't, right? As you were saying, the shelter sucks and you're cold as shit. It was a bad shelter, right?
Yeah. And what you were saying, Eldon, about like the marketing system, it's like food is designed to be delicious. Like, does that mean it's good for me because I crave it? Like, so that's a bad, right, wiring. I have this innate feeling like, wow, like, it's really good. But it's like, I'm bullshitting myself because I have a messed up wiring system. And then there are the things that typically in a natural environment, like coming upon like a field of blueberries, like I would gorge myself. But yeah, marketing is taking advantage of the one like true resource that everybody has is, and that's your attention. Your attention is the most valuable thing, hands down. We know that when we all put our attention onto something, we can like change the frequency of it, right? We know that when we like, marketers are paying billions of dollars for 4 seconds of your attention. That's how valuable it is. They're like, oh, it just came past them. They stopped scrolling for a second, right? They mark that data. They follow your mouse on the web page. Where is the mouse? Right? That they are tracking every little bit of your attention because it is the most valuable resource that you have. In like in phenomenology, this idea that when you give your attention to something, you give life to it and you're already affecting it. So when I give my attention to the birds, to the robin, I'm now impacting it, right? And when I give my attention to the trees and to the earth and to my friends and right, whoever I decide to give my attention to, there's innate value there, right? And that's like something that we have really lost control of and is being like preyed upon, right? We're designed to pick up on movement in our peripheral vision, right? So when I go, like if I find myself in a restaurant and there's like 40 TVs on, like I can't not see all the TVs because like in the forest, I'm like training to pick up on the flick of a deer's tail, right? Know that the cougar is like in the tree hunting. And when I'm out in nature, I'm like listening deeply for that bird song, that bird call. And then when I'm in the city, like this lady, Nicola Pellion, she was one of the longest lasting women at the time to do alone. She did like 88 days on Vancouver Island. And they asked her what was the hardest part about coming back. And she's like, watching myself have to turn that off. Like this jungle sensitiveness, this like amazing superpower that you have to smell and to see and to hear and pick up on these patterns, it's being preyed upon. So you have to turn it down or turn it off. And going through that process is just so heartbreaking. It's just like, oh, I'm a superhero, but nobody likes me.
That sucks. I don't know what the workaround or solution is to that one. I think you just got to turn it off, right?
So the metaphors that I've been using is treating it like a volume knob. Right? It's not an on-off switch. I don't want to turn it off and I don't want to turn it on. I want to be able to mitigate it. And then I want to be able to mess with like the MIDI and the treble and the bass. So like when I moved into Seattle for 4 years intentionally to see if I could keep up my nature connected practices in a major metropolitan city. And it was awesome. There was so much life in the city. Like when you're in the deep forest, like the birds and animals per square mile is like really low. Like when you're in the neighborhood, like the number is really high. Like I would see foxes, raccoons were stealing my chickens. I had birds nesting in my yard. I would watch hawks and owls. And so for me, the birds are like the treble. Like I want to like turn up the treble. Like I want to be aware of like the plants. Like I'm like, oh, walnut tree. Okay. Chestnut tree. Okay. Filing that away. Oh, bus advertising. Like turn that down. Like traffic. Right. I want to be able to kind of mitigate my awareness because the city is actually some of the most densest, richest environments that we all have access to.
Love what you just did there. Thank you. So one of the things that's just coming up as you're speaking to this is like, I feel like sometimes myself personally, I can get like this idea in my head that like there's nature and then there's outside of nature. And like what you're helping me like just remember in this moment is like that's actually like not a thing. Like it's all just nature. And like how I'm relating to what's here is going to describe my relationship to nature. And so like can I tune into the what's real right outside the door, even if I'm like right next to like one of like the big freeways. It's like
Mhm.
I'm driving down the freeway, there's billboards all over here. And when I first moved here, I was like, fuck, man, those things are so distracting. But now I'm like, there's a marshland right on the other side of the freeway, and there's always herons. There's always
Mhm.
like all like little like sandpipers are out there. And it's just like all I have to do is just switch my focus over a little bit, and like that my relationship to that artery, that freeway changes completely.
Yeah, you just shifted your attention, right? It's being fought for here and like consciously, yeah, taking that. I think that's like some of the biggest steps that we can take. And you're right, I've gotten into some debates, right? Our language is not great. It's like, well, everything is nature. Okay. Like there's no not nature. There is manipulated and less manipulated. But like one of my teachers pointed out, like the highway, like those are ground down mountains. All right. If you're an animal, like that's a fucking crazy wall. Right. And so when animals like approach the highway, and that's why they have like these overpasses, right? Because the highway is a wall to an animal. For us, it's like, whoo, I can get places really quickly. But if you're trying to bisect that highway, like it is a game of Frogger, and you will not do well, likely, if you're a possum. And like our houses are, we live in the bodies of trees, right? Our drywall is gypsum and stone and these devices. And so, yeah, in some sense, like everything is nature, and that affords us opportunity for connection when we can look at that and like, oh, like I wonder where the rock from this highway comes from, right? And if we can start asking those questions, we can like have you ever seen a lithium mine? Like they're fucking crazy. But nobody wants to ask that question, like where their car battery comes from,
Super dark.
like, yeah. um and so when we see these things, we both need to be like, oh, like that is nature. It did come from somewhere. And that's kind of my biggest beef with the leave no trace movement. It's like this unattainable goal, right? Leave no trace. Like I actively train as a scout in order to like be undetected and move in and out of environments without leaving tracks. And I will tell you, it is hard as shit to do that. And so to have this idea that I'm going to go outside with like my plastic tent, my metal stove, and all this gear from REI, I'm going to go out into nature. And as long as I don't leave any trash, like I'm good. It's like, well, no, like you left a trace. You had an impact on an environment. It's just an environment that you're unaware of, right? So why don't we shift it to being maybe more aware of our impact, or maybe we can have a positive impact when we go and we connect with these places. Are there practices, and that's what I believe in. Robin Wall Kimmer, she has a book called Braiding Sweetgrass, that one of the simplest acts of reciprocity is offering our attention.
So it's interesting you mentioned something coming up for me right now that I would like to share around, like, I go into the nature outside my house, like, right out back, and I live next to a beautiful little trail system. And I go and do like a morning practice, which is, you know, it's like I do sort of qigong-ish stuff, but there's also a sit spot component to it, and it's just something that's evolved for myself. But I'm quiet and I'm in nature and I'm connecting with my body as well as the world that's around me. And I will experience quite often groups of people, usually between 2 to 8 people, going through that space, and I can hear them from like damn near a mile away. And like oftentimes they're just like a gaggle of like middle-aged women, but like it's all over the, you know, across the board in terms of demographics. But it's just like, and I get like in that moment, I'm like, I get like angry. I'm like, what? Why are you being so loud? Like,
Mm.
Jesus Christ, you know, like, you know, that's my own thing. What you're helping me connect to right now is this idea of like the attention that they're offering. They're just going to a place and they're not even bringing any attention to that place. They're just drawing their attention to each other and like whatever problems they're talking about or their own lives. And they're not really like immersing themselves in what that place has to offer.
Mm.
You just brought something up for me. So like I grew up mountain bike racing, and like my thing was I'd be out in the woods all the time, but I'm going fast and like, you know, carving the turns, hitting the jumps, whatever, right? And at some point, like I stopped, and like I'm currently working in a bike shop. And everyone's like, "Why don't you ride bikes?" I'm like, "I don't have an interest in going that fast through the woods anymore." Like I actually like I found something through like slowing down, Matt, like as kind of like you're talking about, and just like being more quiet and more attentive. There's something that I get from that I never got from riding bikes when I was just going through. You brought up braiding sweetgrass, and there's like a particular part of that book that just like came up for me as you were talking. And I don't remember anybody's names aside from Robin's, but she was sharing about like one of her students doing I think it was like a thesis project on sweetgrass, and how there was like this proposal that like the sweetgrass that was actually harvested might actually do better than the sweetgrass that wasn't. And it was like the professors are like, no way, like there's no way it could happen. But she ends up doing it, and like sure enough, like the sweetgrass that got the attention, the harvesting, the constant like interaction, actually like was much healthier and more robust than the plants that didn't as their control group. And it's just like spring, like you said, this like leave no trace thing. It's like actually like we need to take our place, right? And so
Mm.
like what I hear you talking about is like bringing people back into like what is our place within the ecology of the forest or the plains or the beach or whatever. Like how do we actually be here in a good way, and like with a good relationship to the land and the beings that inhabit it in like in a grounded context. One of the things I was like and I want to, maybe you have resources that you can point us towards, because I have like a wondering right now for myself. It's like I want to learn what seaweeds are harvestable, because I'm out
Mm.
at the beach I'm like walking on these rocks. I'm like, I know some of the stuff here is like good to eat. Like I know it, but I don't know what it is. And like there's this fear inside of me of like trying that. Like I don't want to like poison myself by trying the wrong seaweed, you know? So I'm curious, like, do you have any places that you point people towards for knowledge, like from knowledge keepers that like have these ways of being with the land and like learning to cultivate those types of relationships?
Yeah, there's a couple different directions I can go with this. So yeah, I just want to acknowledge that like you're a human animal. We are human animals. We are having impact, whether you like it, whether you think you are, whether you don't think you are. Even if you sit inside your house all day, you're still impacting the world, right? And it's definitely time to like take some ownership. And when we remove ourselves from the landscape, that has impact, right? Impact through omittance, right? Like if you remove beavers from the landscape, that has impact. If you remove wolves from the landscape, it has impact. And so to pretend that we're not is just like, that's dumb. I mean, like, if you study ecology, they do not consider the human animal in the ecological context. So when they study a marsh and they're like, okay, well, we have cattails and we have these like amphibians and we have these birds, like how do they all interrelate? Da, 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 da. They do not consider the human in that study. When by studying it, you're having an impact, right? Like, and so yeah, I think Robin's book is really great, like just acknowledging that you can take too much and you can take too little, right? And that there are these ways of interacting with the environment that are incredibly beneficial, right? Like John Muir came to the West Coast and he's like, wow, like look at this epic land, like nobody fucked it up. It's so beautiful, like it's so well tended. And they're like, yeah, native people have been tending that space for like 10,000 years, you know, at least. Right? Like all the oak trees are the way that they are because the people of that place shaped them so they could better harvest the acorns, right? A lot of people believe that the Amazon rainforest is like an ancient food forest, right? That people were selecting and interacting and tending these things over untold amounts of time. And so every ecosystem is unique. It's full of microclimates and micro uniquenesses. So it's hard to be like, okay, coastal plains. Well, it's like, okay, well, you go on the north side of this hill and it's very different than the south side of this hill, right? And different at the bottom and it's different at the top. But generally, there's like a lot of principles that we can apply to all landscapes. And yeah, one of those was actually you talked about through the birds. Like you heard a bird, you had a felt sense of something, you paid attention, you connected that an event happened. Well, bird language is a universal. You know, the sounds are different, the calls are different, the birds are different, but the feeling that is being conveyed when a bird is being aware of the other animals is very much a felt sense, a very similarity. And I think we used to have that with plants. We used to have that with animals, and we've been fear mongered to be like, don't touch nature, don't go in nature. You better not even be looking at nature unless you have at least $500 worth of gear on you right now. Okay. Right? Like you see people like going out in these like REI condoms. Like, okay, I got all my rain pants and my thing, and like I'm ready. Like nothing is gonna touch me. I'm not gonna touch anything. And you're like, dude, like you're not. This is not connection. You know. Like one of the first things we like to do is like get mud on people's faces and get their shoes wet. Because like think about it. Like think about how hard you try to avoid getting your shoes wet. And think about how freeing it is when they get soaked.
Well, then where's your attention go? Not to your shoes not getting wet, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean that's something you guys, you, Rafe, Aaron, all you guys at with the Evolving Play events that I've gone to, like opened my eyes to this whole idea of like training in an outdoor space, right? And a more like natural environment, or I guess wild environment, if you, depending on the language you want to use, right? And I've tried to kind of export that to, you know, my own little community. And actually Eldon and I have been putting on these little events,
Nice.
like on a monthly basis, where we meet at the beach and let's just work with what we have there. Last weekend or 2 weekends ago, we met in like a redwood forest, and we worked with that environment, and it's so amazing how much more creativity happens and how much less you have to like work from up in the brain, and you get to like just kind of go with what like inspires you in that moment, right? It's a lot easier to like do freaking awesome stuff, and you don't have to like think about it like, oh, we're gonna do this and then that, and like, you know, like, yeah, it was an amazing sessions with the right the right mindset to approach it. So definitely something I've learned from you guys, and it was amazing.
Yeah, so it's like, where do we start? Like, okay, like I'm disconnected. I live in a city. I don't know a lot. There's, you know, all these possible things that could go wrong. Like, what do I do? Like, it can be really overwhelming. And so I'm pretty simplistic in my approach. Like step one is like just go outside. Right? Even if it's on your porch, even if it's on your balcony, even if you open up a window and stick your head out, like nothing happens until you go outside. Right? And then just be curious. right? Like Eldon, like you're curious about seaweed, right? Awesome. Learn about seaweed, right? You have like the most access. I think like almost all seaweed is edible. I think the only concern is like red tide and like those kind of things. So often we start with so go outside, become curious, whatever catches your curiosity, whether it's a plant, a tree, a bird, an animal, a track, learn about that thing, right? And that thing's going to teach you about all these other things. And so that's one way to follow the journey. I help people take a more structured approach. So like actually learn about your hazards, right? If I learn about, okay, like here in the Pacific Northwest, there's one plant, one berry, I should say, one berry that could kill me. That means all the other berries won't kill me. So now I have a little bit more freedom. Okay. If I know if I know what I'm eating is not that berry, like I can try a little nibble of it. Like, okay, like ticks, rattlesnakes, cougars, bears, what are the main threat to life? Right? They're actually very few. Right. And the thing that's overwhelming is, okay, there's so much to know and to learn. Like, yes, the things that can hurt and kill me are actually very few. And maybe I just learn about those things. And then all of a sudden I have this immense freedom to know that, like, okay, like it's not a bear track. Okay. It's probably somebody's like dog or a coyote. Like, that's fine. Like, not going to mess with me. Like, okay, like what kind of ticks carry Lyme disease? Like, what's the difference between a venomous snake and a non-venomous snake? And so if I can start to identify those pieces, that allows me this exploration. I can creep a little bit further into the edge of the yard, right? And that's the best place to start, is your yard. You're like, cool, I probably no snakes in the grass. Like, not a lot of things are gonna kill me in my own yard. And you'll find, like here in the Pacific Northwest, like there's such low diversity that when I learn about one plant, I learn about like an entire section of the forest. And this is actually the best time. I don't know if you guys have like seasons in California, depending on where you are, I guess. But here we're on the precipice of spring. And the very first shrub to leaf out is the osoberry. And it's the only one. So if I'm walking through the forest and I see any green, any new growth that's green, that's on a shrub, even if it's like really far away, I know that it's probably osoberry, because it's literally the only plant out. So if I just started there, I'd be like, wow, everything you see over there that's green, all osoberry. That green thing over there, osoberry. They're like, how do you know that? Like, I don't, but I bet if we walk up to it, I'm probably right, because it's the only thing out. And then in a couple weeks, the next plant is gonna come. And same with the birds. There's only like robins, juncos, chickadees, wrens, and sparrows. There's only like 5 birds around right now. If I wait till summer, there's like an ungodly amount of different species. Right. So this is actually the best time to start to learn about your environment, because there's actually a lot less things to know.
Really appreciate the approach that you take to like keeping it simple. It's like, it feels so grounded. Like, hey, just go outside. Who's there?
I try to get like complicated with it, and then people just don't do anything. And I'm just like, all right, I'll settle. I will settle for you going outside. Like, that is like the lowest bar I can like round into. And yeah, like Eldon, like you could harvest seaweed and just take it home.
Yeah.
And maybe you learn about it, maybe you don't. But like, you made that step.
I'm going back out. I'm gonna grab some seaweed. I know where to go. Yeah. So one of the things that was popping up for me is just like as a curiosity and a question is like, as you're doing this work with people, right? So you've seen however many people go through this work, like what are things that you notice shift in their lives over time?
There's this like interesting quality about a person when they connect to nature. It's kind of like when you meet somebody and you're like, I wonder if they do Tai Chi. There's like kind of like a flow, a calmness, like an awareness. Like one of my teachers, he just like exudes this like protector energy. You're just like, I don't know why, but I feel safe around this guy. But one of the ways that we grade our students, or one of the ways we are becoming aware of whether or not what we're doing is having any impact, is what we call the like 8 indicators of aliveness. Right. And so we can start to look at these things as like measurable outcomes. And so we have like common sense. Like nature is so good at teaching you about common sense. Right. Like, I don't know how many times I've broken a stick and the stick like breaks in my face. Right. It's like, okay, don't break sticks like that. Like, there's all these, like, if I put up my tent and I'm dry, like I learn these, like, you learn these little tiny skills that are just like innate to being a human, that if someone doesn't know how to do it, you're like, how do you not know how to do this? Right. So common sense, right? Just this ability to make good, logical, rational decisions. And then in the Southeast is the health and like quickness of like a wolf or a coyote, this childlike playfulness and this agility that comes when you're playing and you're moving through the natural environment. You have to go up and over and down and crawl and climb and jump and move. So you have this full body kinesthetic. I remember I used to teach wilderness therapy, and we would take at-risk youth from the city and we'd bring them out into the forest, and they could barely walk on the trails. Right, because they've only ever walked on flat, even graded surfaces. So their proprioceptive ability to navigate complex terrain was really shit. And then there's this inquisitive focus that develops. Like when people get they get obsessed. It's like a curiosity that just like drives you to know something. And right, it happens with like, man, like what can I eat? Like what are these animal tracks? Right, it develops naturally in learning about the environment, but it can translate to business, can translate to a hobby or a project. Like I just need to know everything about how this works and puts together, right? So there's that inquisitive focus. And then we also have this ability to, it's like an empathetic wandering. Like when we harvest plants and we harvest animals, we develop this empathy with the world. We're like, oh, like life takes life. Like I feel a sadness when I'm building my shelter and I have to harvest these trees. I harvest this moss from this rock. Like I have to right? People are like, don't touch nature. I'm like, dude, your house is built of shit that was harvested from nature. Like, when you get your hands in it, you have this empathy of like, wow, like, man, like killing a deer is like it's like an emotional task. And then another one is awe and reverence that you just have. Like people are like, oh, it's just a crow, or like, oh, it's just a robin. I'm like, dude, no, that's a crow. Like that crow is different. Like here where I was living, there's all these deer that just like wander through the neighborhood. Everybody's just like, oh, fucking deer. Well, on my way to the ocean, I would stop in this yard and there was like 12 deer, and I would hang out with them, and I'd just like hang out with them every day. And I get to know them. And I get to know their little like differences, their colors, their little markings. And I started to know them as individuals. And as I was moving throughout the neighborhood, I would see that one deer. I'm like, ooh, that's the one that likes that. That's the one that's been curious about me. Like, I want to give that one like little chin scratches. And I got to see this like buck lose a horn one day, and then the next day it lost an antler, and then it lost another antler, and then it had no antlers, and he was kind of like sad and like pissed because the other bucks still had their antlers. So I got to like know these animals as individuals. And so it's not just a crow, it's not just a tree, even though there are hundreds of them that are the same, right? I can see them as individuals, and I can have this like awe and reverence for the world and the resources around me. And then also there's three more. So there's service in community. So when you are out in nature, like it takes everybody, right? You're like, oh, cool. Like, Matt, you're a healer. Like, cool. We need you to like heal us. Like, oh, like you're an architect. Like, cool. How can we build this shelter? Like, oh, like you know how to like harvest and hunt. Like, awesome. Like, what are your gifts? Like, what can you offer to the group? Right? Maybe you're funny. Maybe you can sing. Maybe whatever it is. Like on a survival trip, like entertainment is like crucial, and so then we have this empowered interdependence that develops, right? Like I might go down the foraging rabbit hole, and then maybe you don't give a shit about plants, but like everything about like fishing. And I'm like, cool, like, well, you get a fish. I got some like nice little like wild onions. I got some wild ginger. Cool. We're gonna spice up that fish. We're gonna like team up together. And then the final kind of like ultimate characteristic that we're looking for is the quiet mind, is the ability to just be as is in any environment, cold, wet, raining, snowing, like just like this is the world, right? Like not hot, it's not cold, it just is.
That's great, man. Yeah, I mean, they do say, like the old books, that the mind is the servant, not the master. I think that's what you were kind of speaking to a lot, or we all were speaking to a lot there.
Mm-hmm.
We don't take our mind and just let it run wild, but we dedicate it to specific things that we want to figure out, and have that curiosity and that curious mind, and use it for these deliberate tasks.
Yeah, and that's what brings us together. And in some ways we've gotten like so good at it that we're no longer reliant on each other for anything. And that's
That's a great way
probably
of putting it.
like, yeah. And that's like the biggest like downfall of community, is like if shit hits the fan, like I don't need you. Like I can order shit on Amazon. Like
But if shit hits the fan, you can't order shit on Amazon. That's the
True.
thing. If it really hits, not like the COVID hits the fan, but like
I meant
real.
like if like interpersonal dynamics of the community
Okay, yeah.
are insufficient enough that I don't want to like work through a problem with somebody, I could just leave the community and go somewhere else. And that's what you see. You're like, oh yeah, like this relationship's like too much work. Like, bye.
Yeah.
That hits close to home.
Yeah, it does.
Man, wait. So there's the.
You put a lot at us there.
I like you, homie. I like you. So there's this thing that you spoke to, right? Like I'm just kind of wrapping this. Like there's many circles that we've gone on in this journey here with the conversation. But one of the ones is like this piece that we actually are like innately interdependent. And it's like you spoke to earlier about like the stone that makes that, like the mountains that make up the highway, and like the lithium ore that gets mined and like is in all of our devices. And then this thing of like leave no trace, don't touch nature, but like, hey man, like you live in a house, like your house is built of nature. And there's this piece of like how disconnected we are from our impact. I'm kind of obsessed with violence. And like I wrote a piece recently around sacred violence, and just like acknowledging that I can't live without violence. Without violence, like without the taking of life, I don't live. And like I hear you speaking to that, and like the connection to that, and like the reverence and awe and empathy that comes from that. And it's like, I feel like for myself personally, like the more I can acknowledge that interdependence between myself and all other beings, especially those that are the closest to me, the more connected I actually am to myself, and the more alive I can feel. And so I just gotta say, man, it was 8, right? 8.
Yeah.
What was the name of them again? Can you say it one more time?
Um,
Not all of them, just like you had like a term that you used to describe the 8.
yeah, the indicators of aliveness.
That's so dope.
And
Yeah.
where did you get those from? This is from...
Yes, that comes from John Young and his book, Coyote's Guide.
I got that book on my bookshelf.
Yeah,
It's
page
a big one, man.
272.
I've been meaning to really dive into it. I've read a few parts of it here and there, but it's a thick one. Yeah,
so the first half is philosophy, and the second half is just all games.
I'm gonna have to get that book.
But yeah, I think what you're speaking to, Eldon, is like this core thing. And I've heard a teacher say, if you can find out the story of just one of your items, like that's a good place to start, right? Because like what are the things that are most meaningful to you? When you harvest food from your garden and you cook that meal for somebody, that's more meaningful, it has more relation. When I make a gift from something that I harvested and then I give it to somebody, and they have the more story associated with these items. Like this shirt, I mostly don't give a shit about this shirt, but my dad gave it to me. Right? Where did it come from before that? Like, I don't know. So I only have one layer of that story, but I have a vest that I killed the deer, I tanned the deer, I sewed the vest, and now I've had that vest for 10 years. I love that vest. That vest is deeply meaningful to me. I wish I knew the story of the deer. Right? Like me and my partner, like we exchange gifts, and they're always like handmade, homemade, hand harvested. Like that's all the stuff that like is meaningful to you. Like if your house is going to burn down, like what are the things that you grab? Like, the more of the story that you can know about any one thing, that's the level of connection. And if we look at ourselves kind of from like a top-down view, and we imagine all these threads of connection going out, like the swamp that I get my cattails from, the mountain that I get my blueberries from, the bog that I get my cranberries from, the places that I hunt the deer, the lakes that I harvest the rice, like the fields where I get the milkweed, like I know where all those places are, and I have a connection to those things, and they actually sustain me and make me, right? Like Alan Watts is really good. He's like, you belong to this earth. Like you were not born into the world, you were born from the world. But we now live in a place where our food, the literal food that makes us, like I'm eating like Atlantic salmon, Indonesian shrimp, avocados from Guatemala, bananas from Brazil, a cow who was raised in somewhere else in Oregon, or like, right? I'm like, if I actually looked at like all of the nutrients that make me, they literally come from different places. Like a lot of people are drinking bottled water. Like you're not even drinking the water from the place in which you live.
Drinking it from Iceland.
Yeah, right.
Or Norway.
Wherever. So it's like, how does that make you? And even like if you can get like super nerdy about it, so if you've ever done like any like Nutraval testing or like these like things, like they literally have different reference ranges in Europe than in the United States because they have different mineral content in the soil. So there's like more boron in like the Middle Eastern Europe than there is in the United States of the soil. So they literally have a different reference range because the food that they're eating is making up the people. Like I don't have all those things in my life. Like I eat from a grocery store and I try to be mindful and drink water from where I'm at. But it's this like constant compromise that all of us are making consciously and unconsciously, that like, why don't we feel like we belong to a place? It's like, well, my people are not of a place. And even if they were of this place, I'm not even made up of this place. So it's like, where do I belong in this like constellation of like, I don't really have like a super awesome history. Right. It's like all of these things, and it's easy to feel like you don't belong, but when you start to realize you do belong and you do have impact, and once you kind of have both of those realizations, you can start taking you start to have choice. Do I look at the billboard or do I look at the swamp? All right, do I buy organic or not organic? And it's not to say that anybody's gonna like do perfect, and it's pretty much impossible to like be in full integrity. But if it doesn't mean we can't start, doesn't mean we can't
Something's
try.
better than nothing,
Yeah.
right? Yeah, this brings up for me something I got from you actually at the fall retreat last year, and you did it the Return to the Source. I loved you had this. Eldon and I and a couple other of us that we're working together with. We've been really into this book called Ritual, and I don't know if you're familiar with it. It's by this guy Malidoma Somé.
Yeah, Malidoma Somé.
And yeah, and I have been really into, for the last couple of years now, bringing ritual into my life. And I have my individual rituals now, and I'm trying to create familial rituals, and I hope to also help be a part of creating community rituals, right? Or ones that have more meaning to me. We have these rituals like a funeral, right? But I had a death in the family. It was so disconnected, this funeral. It was weird, right? Because my family is just very disconnected from themselves and their feelings and like why this exists and all this stuff. So it's really great for me to like kind of bring a more embodied or more connected, and I guess in a way, like using a word that can be a bit divisive, like a more spiritual connection to ritual. And that feels very foreign to me, and I get very like almost like ugh, like I'm becoming like a new age, like gross, like a bunch of hippie bullshit, that kind of comes up in my head. Like that's one voice. And something you did was this gratitude ritual, and you did it before every meal at the EMP events, and I fucking loved that, because it was this way of like, I'm not like putting my hands over the food and putting my positive energy into it and just like thanking everything in this like weird, like new agey way, which I can do and it can be amazing. But for me, it was so much more approachable, because it was like, I'm going to go through what I'm grateful, like who took part and what took part in making this meal, and sending some gratitude that their way. And if not like they feel it, I have an added sense of meaning to what it took for this meal to be on my plate. And that means a lot just in its own right. So there's definitively value that's gained from this ritual. Like I can see it right in front of me. And so it's like, okay, like I can definitely get behind that. If I share that with my, scientific father and he's like, what are you doing? Like I have a very easy way, that voice is in my head. I have a very easy way of like, hey, this is highly valuable. Like jump on board. So thank you for that. Really appreciate it. Bringing that to my family.
Hmm. Yeah, I'm grateful to hear of the impact, and I think as a father of somebody, in your position, yeah, like one of my teachers, he told a story about kind of like lineage carrier, and he was training these two people, and it takes like 20 years to kind of learn all the skills, and they both ended up dying in kind of like a war situation, and the teacher was too old to teach anybody these skills, and so they were going to go away. And he's like, well, like what's going to happen to these things? Like they're going to go away. And he's like they're going to return to the earth from which they came. Right, all of these like rituals and traditions, they all emerge from deep listening to the earth. Yeah, there's some like total bullshit and weird shit and un disconnected connect. There's all kinds of things out there, but I think if we feel like we're in integrity and deep listening, and we have received something, like in a way it's like our duty to bring that, to our children and to our families, and if it feels like it resonates in the community, to acknowledge that and bring those back. Because yeah, we're in this like tricky place of like, well, there's like a lot of cultural appropriation, there's a lot of spiritual bypassing, there's a lot of like pulling from, but it's like, how can we do that in really small ways, and how can we do that in like in bigger ways, and look at these traditions that exist across all cultures, right? So I don't have to like do a sweat lodge and sing a Lakota song and like do all this stuff, but like maybe I like have a sauna and I sing with my friends, on Monday nights. Like that seems like a cool like thing to do. Like that seems like a worthwhile endeavor. And maybe we make up songs and we make these universal things. We bring them into our life in an authentic way, and the people that come, like, everybody who comes to these retreats that we put on, and all the teachers, like they are co-creating this experience, right? And shaping what we do, and it grows and it evolves, through time, just as anything else does. And so I think, yeah, it's really cool that like you're, being courageous and doing this thing that like maybe it's weird, but like my son doesn't know that it's weird. Like he's gonna think it's like the coolest shit, and he might not know why he's doing it for years, and then it builds and it grows. And so I think that's like, I think that's just something we have to do, because like, what do we do? Not do it and just live in the fear, and watch all of these traditions and people and languages and ways of being, we just watch them like all die out. Like, is that what we do? Because we don't want to like offend anybody.
There's I wanted to just kind of like catch the tail end of this piece around like the gratitude for food. I have my own like food gratitude practice, which does involve putting my hands over the food, but is also like that action for me is not like I'm going to infuse the food, but more it's like I'm actually like trying to pick up on the energy of the food, like what's here in my bowl, and consider it, and consider all of the things that have happened for that food to get to me. But the thing that is like stands out the most for me in that practice is actually being like somatically aware of what happens in my body as I do that. I feel myself move into a parasympathetic state. I feel my gut turn on. I feel the digestive enzymes beginning, and it's like, oh, like this actually, from a very practical sense, like it just works. This is how I prepare for eating. And it's like, yeah, it just like smelling, like anyway, it's all there. And I love, Kyle, like what you spoke to around like, hey, like let's create, not appropriate, like create intentional rituals that are inspired by traditional knowledge in ways that are actually true for us. I'm like, hard yes to that, yo. Like, thank you for those words. It's a really powerful call into action. So I recognize that like you know, especially folks that are kind of like trying to be socially aware. It's like, oh, what can I do? Like, where are the boundaries? And like, I feel like you just offered a really practical approach to that. And I love that. Thank you.
Yeah, and you're gonna do it poorly. Like just like anything else that you do, like you're gonna do it and it might be awkward, it might be weird, it might totally bomb. And that's the opportunity for that feedback, okay, like didn't quite land, or I got some feedback that felt a little bit like whatever, like okay, cool, like I'm not immune to that, like I want that. I want to know how I'm impacting others. But I also like you can give me feedback. That doesn't mean I'm gonna change. Like, cool, I hear your feedback. Like, thank you. I'm gonna consider that. I'm gonna file that away. If I get enough feedback on that same thing, then maybe I will affect a more like greater change in my life. But yeah, I think like that's the thing. Like, even like I've had elders in ritual, like some rituals start because of like massive fuck ups. Like people like fucked it up and now that's the new ritual. Like, okay, like why do you do this? Because like 10 years ago, this guy like totally bombed on this thing and it was funny and now we do it. Like there's no like it has to be done in this way. Like that's just dogmatic. Like, it takes away from the organicness of which everything emerged from.
Yeah, things are constantly evolving, so we have to let it continue to evolve. If we just stay in that one path, just will grow stagnant.
Yeah, like even at like the fall retreat, like I couldn't get the fire going.
That's
I had
right.
to like switch it up, and then we did it in a new way that I've never done it before, and it like totally worked. And like cool, maybe I'll do that. I was just having that humility, that awareness of like what wants to be versus like what we're trying to like make happen, right? We want to be in that right relationship, like a plant wants to grow, but like me pulling on the plant is like really not helping it grow. So it's like, okay, well, I have to let it be, but I can like nurture it and I can care for it. And yeah, like just like with like children, just like in partnerships and relationships and friendships, like they change and shift and move. And if I expected like my friend to like be the same person like every time, at some point I'm gonna be disappointed.
There's this part of what you were just talking about was bringing up for me this, like, I labeled it and worded it like the bottom up approach to learning. And then the top down approach to learning. And my experience of like the top down, like kind of like the schooling, right, that we receive is like, it's a lot of it is training us not to make mistakes and to be able to like categorize what's a mistake and like so that we don't have to make them. And like the bottom up approach is like trial, error, success. It's like you're constantly making mistakes, having successes, getting that feedback. And like in that approach, that's accepted. It's like part of the thing that's supposed to happen. And like that's how we grow and evolve. And so you said this thing of like, yeah, it's gonna be messy. Like we're not gonna get it right. Like let's let it happen. I don't know. It's just all bringing that up for me.
Yeah, you said something earlier, and I really like this framing, so I'll kind of bring this in. Is like a teacher, John Vervaeke. He's been really influential on a lot of our work, and he has this idea of these 4 ways of knowing. And I really have just like it's been so illuminating for me to reframe the way that I see the world. And so we live in this like propositional tyranny where it's like facts and things and like this is that, that's a this, dude, like everything. I can look this up. This study says this. It's all of these just words of facts, information about the world. And then there's procedural knowing. So how to do something step by step, right? I like cut this piece of wood and I put it on this and then I put it together. And then there's participatory knowing. There's knowing by participating in the thing, right? And it was really funny. Like my buddy watched a YouTube video on like how to build a fence. And so we had a procedural step-by-step list of how to do it. But when we went to go do it, it was way fucking harder than we thought it was. And we were like, oh,
that
we're
works.
getting some participatory knowing, like, oh, like he says cut it like this, but actually you have to cut it like this, right? You know, through by like, how do you know what it's like to be in a relationship? Well, you only know by being in a relationship. Like, what is it like to be in a relationship with Matt? Like, well, I don't know. I can only tell you if I'm like being in it. And then there's the perspectival way of knowing. And that's like, what is it like to be me in this situation? So like, what it like when maybe I'm angry. So like, it's not just like how am I building this fence, but I'm actually in a perspective. Maybe I'm happy, maybe I'm sad. Like, what is it like to be me? And these are all associated with different memories. So you could actually lose your memory in one aspect and have it in another. And why this was so good is because what I realized at the school that I was going to is I was experiencing all of these participatory experiences. Like I was learning how to make fire by making shitloads of fire. I was learning how to track animals by tracking animals all day for weeks at a time. And then people become ripe for propositional information. You're like, hey, I see you're trying to make this fire and you're not doing a great job. Like, can I offer you a tip? Right? People are more ripe. And they're like, oh, I can't get it. And you're like, have you tried this? And then they're like, oh my God. Or like, what did you learn from that? And so these non-propositional ways of knowing, I'm hopeful that will come back around into the kind of like ether. Like that's like what our retreats are. Like we don't like tell you a lot of like what we're doing. Like, okay, like you're gonna roughhouse, like make sure you move your arm at a 30-degree angle when a person attacks you and only support 34% of their weight while you shit, it's like we don't say anything. We're like, cool, like go play this game, let me know like how it was. And then people are like, oh my God, I learned so much about my body and I learned so much about this other body and how we moved together in this space. And it was like, how did you do that? It's like, oh, like we just did it. And so that's like really what I'm excited to see come back into the world and to see and to convey the value of that way of knowing to people from a valid kind of like stance. Like, yes, like this is a thing. Unfortunately, we have to use like the scientific perspective to validate it. But
so when you say that, that right there, what you just said brings up a whole nother thing. But I immediately am thinking of like the prison system that I was a part of called the public school system, where they fucking lock you in a room with a bunch of other kids and you're just like bombarded with this propositional knowledge day after fucking day. And it like entrains us like to work in that world. We're not getting our hands dirty and we're like scared to make mistakes, to kind of speak to what Eldon was saying even too. I was terrified for years to make mistakes. And I had to like retrain my brain in my early 20s to like, it's feedback, not failure.
That's a good line right there.
Yeah. From NLP, it's like, it's a good thing. It has some stuff, but so I look at it now as a father. I've got 2 young children. They aren't in school yet, but I have like, I don't want to say like terror, but I do have like a small anxiety, and like it's building as they get older of like, how the hell am I going to not expose them to that way of doing things? Because that like crushes people's spirit. It crushed my spirit. I had to break free of that. And I think I'm still breaking free of that to this day. And so it's like, how do I do education, and how do I set up and be a part of education for my children that doesn't do that? That is what you're talking about, immersing them in participation of things, and then being ripe for that knowledge, right? Like, oh, I'm reaching this issue. Like, how do I solve that? And then it's like, well, you could try that. And they're like, oh my God. And then they grab onto it. Right. And that's in them forever then, as opposed to like, I memorized it in a book and then, oh, test is over. It's gone. Never to be found again.
Yeah, right. Yeah, like think like the origin, like teacher means to like put in, and education though means to educe, to pull out. But we got so stuck in the putting in, we're not like pulling out the innate knowledge and teaching people how to be problem solvers. I am so confident in my ability to learn basically anything. Like I've done electrical, I've done carpentry, I've like I've built and made all kinds of shit because like I know how to solve problems. I know where to go to learn. I know how to learn, and I'm okay with making mistakes and like not doing it perfectly. And like I think if that was our education system for children, like we would like the ability to creatively problem solve would be insane. Like we like whenever we think of a problem, we have like such a narrow solution set because of that. But if we were trained in this like reverse way, like think about like the creative solutions that you couldn't even think of. And yeah, what the value that would bring to the world.
Yeah, that's real. I mean, so I have a 7-year-old daughter. She's in first grade, and it's like Matt, like what you were just speaking to is like very much like a living thing for me right now. It's like, how do I make sure that this child who is like, and she likes school, like she enjoys it, but it's like, how do I make sure that she's getting the other things that she needs? It's like not just being filled with language and math and whatever, but like, staying connected to art, staying connected to like the ability to like freeform play. And it's like, and like in some ways I feel like we're doing like a really good job as parents of like supporting that. And then in other ways it's like so I'll give a tangible example. My daughter is afraid of this forest, like legit afraid of the forest. And then she's afraid of mountain lions, specifically cougars. And like I know why, and it's like it's my fault. And it was because we lived on a ranch like in the back of a valley that like had cougars coming through the property. And she was like a young kid who was like, I had to like let her know, like, hey, you can't go by yourself from here to there right now. Like I heard a cougar kill a deer in the creek behind our house like a couple nights ago. Like it's just not happening. Like you can't do it.
Yeah.
But now she's been removed from the forest for a while. Like she's comfortable in beach areas, she's comfortable in these other areas, but the forest, she's afraid of. I'm like, all right, we got to go in the forest. Like you have to, like, I was like letting her know the other day as this education experience of like, okay, so like, what do we know about cougars? Like one, like stay close to me if we're out in the forest when it's dawn and dusk. Like if you're really afraid, like, let's not go out in the forest at those times. Like, let's go like midday. And like just like letting her know what in my limited knowledge of like cougar behaviors, and like doing some research right now so that I can help her to learn how to feel okay in the forest, knowing that these beings are there.
Yeah, that's really beautiful. I think that's the work. It's like, like I did this thing that was a good thing, but I kind of fucked up a little bit.
Exactly.
That's okay.
And that's okay. Like that's great. Like you're not like beating yourself up about it. You're like, okay, like I did this thing. Like it was useful and helpful at the time. It's no longer as helpful. Okay, how can I like and that's just like, yeah, really beautiful like humility to be able to shift and to offer that.
Thank you. Yeah. I mean, there's one thing like, you're talking about like relation, like you don't know how to relate to Matt until like you're relating to Matt. Like this is just what it is. And like there's that question of like, as people like are learning to become parents, it's like, so what's it like to be a father? It's like, I don't know, but like I'll tell you one thing, like be prepared to make mistakes, because like you're gonna fuck up. Like I feel like that's like the most successful relational like advice that I could ever give anybody, inclusive of myself, is like learn how to fuck up well.
Yeah. It's like you can't propositionally tell somebody how to be a good father.
No.
They're like, okay, well, what's the list? What are well, okay, what's the procedure? You're like, no.
There's a lot of books out there that would disagree with you.
For sure.
My wife tried to make me read a lot of them too. Well, it seems like the energy has come down a little bit in this conversation. I'm pretty tired. That was a pretty energetic little chat.
Mhm.
I appreciate you climbing aboard with us here, Kyle. This was super fun. You have
Yeah, thank you.
a lot of knowledge in that brain of yours. A lot of experience too.
Yeah, thank you. Super good to see your faces and chat and hear your stories and experiences, and yeah, kind of what things that you're mulling on. And yeah, it's always good for me to try to like explain my perspective in a way that I can like also look back and think about it and be like, yeah, how is that changing? What's true, what's not true, or like what are these different aspects? And then is there a through line that kind of connects that? And I think just some of the things that we touched on are just like, yeah, like we have impact as people, good, bad, otherwise, on the humans around us, the world around us, the non-humans. Like we have impact. We belong. We belong to a people, we belong to a place, we belong to a community, we belong on this earth as we are. And our attention and our awareness mutually like interpenetrates and like interaffords like all of those things. Like what we choose to give our attention to. I think those were some of the like big themes that stood out for me, and yeah, just things I want to remind myself as well of like, yeah, like I'm an imperfect person living in modernity with a lot of sweet electronics and all kinds of nifty gadgets, and yeah, but also yeah, just trying to move forward in the best way that we can. It sounds like I hear that and you both as like being fathers and being responsible for future humans growing up on this earth is just like, yeah, like we're always doing the best that we can and we're taking in feedback so that we can do it better. I wish you were my
Something you want to say, Eldon?
Oh, just yeah, Kyle, I mean, I really appreciate what you brought in here today and the way that you wrap like the way that you wrap stuff. It's like there's a both and approach. It's like yeah, like experience and then also like understand what you're experiencing. Like this constant like and that feels like there's a balance within that feels like I really enjoyed the way that you were able to describe that and to ground it in an experiential conversation. It was really masterful, yo. Really appreciate it. And I want to make sure, like, as we're kind of closing up, like, Kyle, like, where can people find you and your work? Like, if there's a place, like, where do people find you?
Yeah, the best way to find me or communicate with me is on Instagram. You can also email me, but at Trotting Sparrow, Kyle at trottingsparrow.com. And then I also run retreats with a company called Evolve Move Play. And we have 3 retreats coming up during the summer season. Yeah, so check us out, evolvemoveplay.com or Trotting Sparrow on Instagram. You can message me. I'm super available for conversation.
So before we leave, there was something I wanted to talk about that we didn't get to talk about. And so I want to plant a seed for another day, if you're open to that.
Yeah.
And you had referenced very briefly in our conversation about working with at-risk youth in nature. And that is an experience that I am super curious about. And I've been very interested in this concept of rite of passage. And, there's this massive issue in our culture particularly with young men, but I think it's also with young women. But I mean, the young men, it's even more obvious of a lack of rite of passage in our society. And I think it's a big thing that there's a lot of room for growth, I guess, in our culture in creating more like constructive and more intentional ways. And so I'm very curious to dive in with you about your experiences working with at-risk youth, and also like draw upon your experiential wisdom and just your experiences with that to see, what can be grown from that place.
Yeah,
So,
got some hilarious stories.
yeah, I can't wait. I can't wait to talk to you about that. So I want to just put that out there because we didn't get to it, and I feel like we're kind of reaching a close. So I don't want to dive into it because I want to give it its like necessary space to breathe.
For sure.
Round two.
For another day.
Awesome. Thank you, guys.
All right. Well, thank you, Kyle. Appreciate you, man.
Take care.
Thanks, yo.
All right.
If you're curious about our 9-month Initiate program, check out the link in the description.
When you're ready to begin your journey, visit elementalmovement.life. We'll see you there.